Welcome to the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, a series of educational podcasts that showcase the connection between human capabilities and good work design, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia.
Welcome to this Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia podcast, where we're going to be talking about one of the emerging and important areas of human factors ergonomics, that of psychological health and safety at work. My name is Dr. Robyn Coman, and I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Wollongong within the OHS academic program. At UOW, I teach human factors ergonomics and workplace injury management at undergraduate and postgraduate level. With me today is Associate Professor Carlo Caponecchia.
Hi, Robyn.
Tell us a bit about your role at University of New South Wales.
Sure, Robyn. So I'm an academic here at the University of New South Wales, Associate Professor in the School of Aviation. I have a background in psychology. I work in human factors and safety. So I do things across all sorts of domains, which is why human factors is so great. I can do things across all sorts of industries. I do a lot of work in psychosocial hazards and risks. And I've been working on the new international standard on psychological risks at work and advising on the codes and regulation that's now in place in Australia.
So in this podcast, we're going to be considering psychosocial hazards and how they relate to human factors ergonomics and what we need to do about them. These particular hazards are an area that everyone is talking about. And why is this so? We might pass to you, Carlo.
Well, Robyn, I think you're right. Everyone's talking about these kinds of hazards right now. And I think there's a few reasons for that, a few things that have really sort of come to a head in the last 6 months or so. The major thing that's happened is that we've had changes to the WHS regulations, and they've been implemented in most states now. And so psychosocial hazards have really been escalated into regulation. So instead of being part of guidance material, they've moved to regulation. And that was an outcome of the Boland Review of the Model Act, where one of the major recommendations was to move psychosocial hazards into regulation. So that's really energised people, because as soon as you move something into regulation, you have to do something about it. It's not just maybe consider doing something about it, or maybe you should. It's now you really have to. That doesn't mean that these duties are new, of course. It's important to say that as well. So duties to protect people from psychological harm have existed for decades. It's always been there in definitions of health. It's been there in various regulations around the states as well. But this has been a real escalation to enshrine this in regulation. So I think that's one of the key issues. Before we had the regulation, in some states we had codes of practice. So usually you'd have regulation, then codes of practice, but we kind of had codes of practice and then regulation, which is a bit weird. But many states also now have implemented codes of practice on psychosocial risks, and that's also really energised people towards thinking about what they need to do within their organisation about psychosocial risks. So lots of things all pointing in the same direction of really needing to become more aware of what these hazards are and what we should do about them.
Could you expand a little on what psychosocial hazards are? What are some of the common ones?
Sure. Okay, so the basic definition that we use of psychosocial hazards are aspects of job content, work organisation and management, and environment and organisational conditions that can have the potential for psychological and physical harm. That's the basic definition. I know it sounds pretty wordy, but it's actually really important, and I use it a lot because the definition of these hazards actually contains within it what we need to do about these hazards. So it's really important. So job content So what are people doing? What are the tasks? Work organisation and management. How is work arranged, organised? That's timing and structures and supervision. And what are the environmental and organisational conditions? So what's the culture like and what's the physical environment like? And how do all those things together potentially affect people psychologically? Of course, the definition also recognises that psychosocial hazards have physiological effects, and that's important. We're not just talking about psychological states. These psychological states are, of course, physiologically mediated. And it's important to remember that, because sometimes people kind of seek to delegitimise this by thinking that it's just about people's feelings, for example.
And of course, here you'll be talking about the fact that psychosocial hazards can result in both mental health disorders and musculoskeletal disorders.
Absolutely. So there's really great research, including really good Australian research, that talks about the important interaction between these types of hazards, psychosocial and hazardous manual tasks. But of course, I don't know why we think that's surprising. Of course, hazards interact. Work is a system. People are exposed to all sorts of things in a work system, and those hazards can either, one hazard can either lead to another hazard, one hazard can exacerbate another hazard, and cumulatively they can have an effect. So the interaction of hazards is really not very surprising. But importantly, that interaction is something that's actually been picked up in the new regulations. So that interaction is noted in the regulation as something that organisations need to take note of when they're identifying and controlling these hazards. It's a really important point. It's one that I think people really struggle with and haven't quite got their head around yet.
And in terms of the management of these psychosocial hazards in an organisation, where does it fit? You know, is it in a large organisation? Who is responsible for managing these psychosocial hazards? Is it within human resources, or does it sit with senior management?
Well, I mean, the simple but probably not very satisfactory answer is it sits with everybody, because everybody has responsibilities to hazards, to identifying and managing hazards. But you raise a good point there about knowing who's really responsible. Typically, it does fall to work health safety people to manage these hazards, but we need to recognise that some of the things that we need to do about these hazards are things that human resources people are typically responsible for. So we need people working together across those kind of disciplines to manage them together.
In terms of the role of a human factors ergonomics practitioner, where are they involved in the management of psychosocial hazards?
So in terms of the role of the human factors ergonomics person, I think human factors ergonomics as a discipline and a perspective is actually really important for psychosocial risks. Part of the reason for that is the interactions that we were talking about. Human factors ergonomics does take a systemic approach. And so human factors ergonomics people are really well placed to help people understand how hazards interact. So rather than what's tempting to do, which is to just look at one hazard in isolation in a row of a spreadsheet and give one isolated control for it, maybe a few isolated controls for it. Human factors ergonomics people know how hazards can interact and can help organisations to think about these things in a more systemic way, so that we're dealing with the whole work system, the whole safe system of work, rather than just isolated hazards. And that's really important, because what we often find with psychosocial hazards, and indeed with all kinds of hazards, is that oftentimes one control can have an effect on multiple hazards. So you get really good bang for your buck. One control can affect lots of different hazards. And that's the beauty of seeing this as a dynamic system where you can change elements of work design and have a really impactful effect.
So, Carlo, can you give us some examples of common psychosocial hazards?
Sure. There's a basic set of examples that we tend to use, and if people are looking for more examples, there's really great resources. You can go to Code of Practice in your jurisdiction. Also, the new ISO standard 45003 has a great, really comprehensive list of examples of hazards. But in terms of the common examples that I tend to use, we talk about workload, so workload, pace and schedule. We talk about control and autonomy. Control is really, it used to be called decision latitude. It's about how much of an ability people have to make decisions about their work, when their work's done, how their work is done. And it's often really affected through consultation or lack thereof. So it's a really very important one. Other examples are aspects of the environment and equipment that's available for people. So, the physical environment of temperature and lighting and those kinds of things, but also the equipment. So everyday equipment that's provided or not provided, the nature of it, the quality of it, and also, protective equipment. People often wonder about that one as well. But I think there's a pretty common example there given to us through COVID. If you're in healthcare settings and you didn't have protective equipment provided, well, people became quite anxious and worried about what else they might be exposed to. Great example of PPE creating psychosocial risks. And again, another great example of the interaction of hazards. These hazards don't exist in a vacuum, of course. Other examples, of course, are issues of relationships, supervision and support, opportunities for career development or lack thereof, and job insecurity and issues of bullying, violence, harassment and discrimination. Of course, those are all very particular behaviours, so I cautiously put them together in one category. They're all different. Bullying is different to violence, is different to harassment, is different to discrimination, and it's important to know how they differ. Because, of course, the management strategies and the responsibilities and the legal implications could be different. So it's important to look at how they are different. And it's important to note that those ones that I've just talked about, of bullying, harassment, violence, discrimination, they can occur as hazards in their own right, but they can also occur in combination with the other hazards. So they might be more likely to occur where there's poor relationships. So a whole range of examples. And it's really important, I think, to take those common examples and think about how they actually play out in your real work environment. So even the list of examples that we've given there can seem a little bit abstract. It's important to really take them and think about the specifics of what they might look like, because they might look slightly different in different work contexts.
And just extending on what you've been saying there about the fact that psychosocial hazards need to be seen in the context of the work system, how would an organisation go about identifying these hazards and assessing them?
Sure. Well,
because it's important for them not to see them siloed. They should be seeing them as a hazard along with other hazards then in the workplace.
Absolutely. So taking a systemic view, what we always advocate is the idea that, these are hazards like any other hazard and they should be managed in the same kind of way. Indeed, that's what the regulation essentially says. Manage these hazards like you would any other hazard. If you want a one-line description of what's new in the reg, manage these hazards like any other hazard. That's really all you need to know. That's what it's saying. Code of practice says the same kind of thing. Those documents are talking about basic risk management procedures that you would use for any other hazard as well. So what do? You use a basic risk management process that you would use for anything else. So what does that involve? We all know what it involves. Understand the context, identify the hazards, assess the risks, control the risks or risk treatment, and consult and communicate, monitor and review at all of those stages as you're going through it. So that's the basic process that gets embedded into many organisations' safety management systems.
And there are tools available, such as People at Work, that was developed in collaboration with WorkSafe Queensland.
Yeah, there are a whole bunch of tools. So with that risk management process, I've made it sound really, really simple, haven't I? It's not always that simple, but we should also be cautious about not making it seem too difficult. We've had a history over decades of people sort of throwing their hands in the air and saying, these hazards are different, and they're too difficult, and I don't understand them. Well, that's got to stop. It's in the reg. We've got to do it. So it's time to, skill up. But in terms of identification, common strategies are used to identify these hazards, including, your basic consultation processes where people identify hazards, consultation process. You can identify hazards through regular surveys that you do or through bespoke surveys where you ask about these kinds of hazards. Lots of organisations are using their engagement surveys, though they're not necessarily tailored to identify all these hazards, but they are organisations are using those engagement surveys to do this as well. Observation, understanding what your business is and what the likely hazards are. I think that's an important one to keep in mind. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you know what the hazards are. You've just got to have a think about what it is you do, what your purpose is, what your business is, what your business model is. You know what the hazards are. You know what people are likely exposed to. You don't have to have a survey about everything to know what people might be exposed to.
And do you think a key challenge has been an understanding on the part of both management and workers about what the psychosocial hazards are?
Yeah, that has been a real challenge. I think it remains a challenge. People do feel less confident with these hazards because it's not necessarily in their experience. Though we've been talking about them and socialising these for a very long time. We didn't just wake up one day and there was regulation and codes of practice. This has happened for decades. It's been in guidance for years and years and years. So I'm getting a little less patient with the idea of, I don't know what these hazards are. That's part of due diligence. You've got to know what these hazards are. If you don't know what these hazards are, go and find out. There's plenty of resources. In fact, some people say there's too many resources. There's too many sources of information. There's plenty of ways to find out about these. They're not that difficult. Don't worry, you can do it.
And there's also resources available now, once you've identified the hazards, to undertake formal risk assessment.
Yeah, there are. So there's a range of different tools that you can use that step you through different parts of the process. So People at Work is one example. It's available free. It's supported by the Australian government. It's a survey-based methodology initially that does the identification of different hazards. And then there's a process that it guides you through, which is a participative process, so familiar to lots of people in human factors economics, a participative, consultative process where you take the outcomes of the survey and you reflect that to groups of workers and work with them in a participative environment, sort of focus group environment, to figure out what you might do to change. So you make action plans.
And they'd be involved with you in developing risk control strategies.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, it's great in terms of consultation. It's great in terms of participation. Those are all things that we're supposed to do as part of risk management, as what we're supposed to do as part of safety management systems. So that's hitting all the right areas there. So that tool's a good one to look at. But there are a whole range of others that can help to specific parts of the risk assessment, if that's what you're looking for, as well as doing other ways to identify risks.
So, Carlo, can you tell me a bit more about the barriers to improving the management of psychosocial hazards at work?
There's a whole range of barriers. We've done some work on this recently, asking people in various industries about what are the things that facilitate managing these issues more effectively, and what are the things that get in the way. One of the main barriers is terminology, so just being familiar with what the terms mean. I think there's also some confusion around how these hazards relate to mental health and how we think about, for me, it's about how we think about sources of harm versus outcomes. So mental ill health being among the outcomes that can occur from a psychosocial hazard, as opposed to where many people go when you say psychosocial risk, where they think about the notion of someone with mental ill health or someone with a mental ill health condition. So I think we get tied up in some of the already stigmatised and already misconstrued ideas that we have in the community around understanding mental health. So I think that's one of the barriers. We have to remember here that in a work health and safety framework, we're dealing with the prevention of sources of harm, hazards. We're not dealing with managing someone's mental ill health condition. That might be relevant and might be something that organisations need to support, but it's not the main focus. What we're talking about when we talk about psychosocial hazards and risks is understanding what's going on in the work system, the job tasks, the work organisation, like we said in the definition, work organisation and management, the environment, the equipment, what's going on that's under the organisation's control that could be presenting sources of harm, which might end up influencing a mental ill health outcome, or exacerbating someone's mental ill health status, or having other outcomes that might not reach clinical significance but are still evidence of harm impacting that person's health and psychological health. So there's some important distinctions there, and it's understandable why people get a little bit confused there. So I think terminology issues are really important. One of the things I always say to people about those terminology issues is that even though there's lots of guidance, your organisation probably already has some existing policies and has probably used some language already. It's important to maybe take some time to map what terminology you use to what terminology is used in the jurisdiction that's relevant to you, and to do a little taxonomy maybe for your organisation to say, when we talk about hazards, these are the terms we use. When we talk about the strategy level, this is the term we use. We call it our psychosocial risk strategy versus our mental health strategy versus our wellbeing strategy, right? Because they're all kind of different. But taking a little bit of time to work out what terms do we use and when do we use them and what do they mean for us can be really useful to having consistent communication across your business and making sure that everyone's on the same page. So there's a barrier, and my suggested remedy for it. I think there's a bunch of other barriers though. They include not knowing whose role it is to manage psychosocial risks. It's kind of a bit of a hot potato. Is it HR? Is it WHS? Because I always think it's WHS, but I think it's WHS in concert with everyone else. Everyone's got a role to play in this. And sometimes that means not just pointing the finger and saying this is your job versus this is your job, but also taking some time to understand the different frameworks by which those roles might operate. So work health and safety operates with a slightly different framework to human resources. The objectives are different. And so taking some time to understand how they differ and how they might be able to work together is important. Same goes for, injury management and rehabilitation.
So, Carlo, can you tell us a bit more about risk control interventions in relation to psychosocial hazards? What
sure.
are they? What's been effective, what's been ineffective?
Sure.
So, of course, what everyone wants to know is what do they need to do to address these psychosocial hazards? So can you tell us a bit about risk controls, the sort of interventions that have been used, what have been the most effective?
Yeah, controls is what everyone's interested in. Just tell me what I need to do. We've done a little bit of work looking at what organisations are currently doing, looking into the literature, and some of the most common controls at the moment have been things like, and this may not be surprising to many people, things like training, stress management training, mindfulness training, wellness interventions, health and exercise and well-being sort of interventions, resilience training as well. They're the common ones. Unfortunately, they're not where organisations need to focus at all, because all of those are very much individually focused. Right? They're not really addressing the sources of harm. They're essentially saying the sources of harm are going to continue and we're just going to help you get better at dealing with the sources of harm that we haven't done anything about. That's not what we do in health and safety. It's also not what we do in human factors economics, right? We want to have effective interventions and risk controls. So we always want to move our risk controls close to the source of harm. Essentially, the overarching umbrella that we talk about for risk controls for psychosocial risks is work design, or work redesign. So changing the way that the work is done. And going back to the definition of psychosocial risks, the things that we need to do are in the definition. Where we need to focus is in the definition. Work tasks, work organisation and management, environment and equipment, and organisational conditions. They're the things that should be the focus of our controls. And so a work design perspective that, comes from a human factors background, doing a bit of a task analysis, is to understand how is the work being done? How could it be changed? What small changes could we make to change the nature of this work, to remove or reduce the likelihood of that hazard creating a risk? So it might be about thinking about how many people there are to do the work, thinking about when the work is scheduled and how it might be done differently, thinking about whether there's effective supervision and putting in different supervisory arrangements. That might also mean that you might need to train some people to be supervisors. And while you're doing that, thinking about another hazard, potential psych hazard of a lack of career development opportunities, well, maybe you can train some of these people, give some of the people professional development opportunities, which solves the career development potential hazard, while also redesigning the work. So they're getting an opportunity themselves to develop their career, and that team is getting better supervision. So there's your bang for your buck. One work design strategy solving more than one hazard, showing again that this is a system and that there's multiple hazards interacting in any one scenario. So it's really about work design. And that's why this is really important for human factors and ergonomics people. This is the stuff that we do. This is the stuff that we know. And this is what we can really have an impact on organisations.
So that key message of optimising the design of work, not focusing on the individual and their capacity.
Absolutely.
Because I think an analogy is that of noise. We wouldn't try to train a person to be more tolerant of hazardous levels of noise.
That's right.
We'd look at redesigning the work and redesigning the workplace.
That's right. Absolutely. We would never just say, we need to make you better at dealing with noise or dust or heat or anything else. The analogy I often use is a cake analogy. where the interventions that we tend to use of well-being and resilience and yoga on the lawn, those kinds of things, are like the icing on the cake. No amount of icing fixes a bad cake. You've got to make the cake first, and the cake is made through work design. So make a really good cake, and once you've done that, meaning having a work system that has minimised wherever possible, eliminated and or minimised the potential for psychosocial hazards, making a great cake is the priority. And then, if you want, well, then you can ice it. Then you could do wellbeing programs. Then you could do yoga. Then you could do massage. Then you could do all of those other nice things, those nice, sweet things that make things look great and feel great. But no amount of icing fixes a bad cake.
Thanks for joining us at the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia, where human-centred design really matters. If you like this podcast, make us your favourite in your podcast app. We look forward to chatting with you next time.